Manish, welcome to the People Quotient podcast. So lovely to see you after all these years. It's been 20 years now.
I know, 20 years, 2 decades. Rahul.
You still have your full head of hair. I have lost all of it. So
Yeah.
one of us has aged, the other one hasn't. And we'll let the audience figure out who has and who hasn't.
But you look slim and smart, nevertheless. Like, I mean, the way you used to be in college.
But tell me, one of the things that I'm most excited about as I've thought about this interview, other than obviously catching up with you, it has been so long, and I'm so glad that we're doing this, is your journey. When I looked through your background, and just trying to catch up with everything you've done so much, from your days in Procter& and Gamble, to, startups, to running multinationals, to running small scale, scaling them, exiting. You've done it pretty much everything. And from my perspective, that has to be a fulfilling journey. And now you have started a VC fund, which is investing in startups. And we'll get into that as to the type of startups you guys are investing in. But when you reflect on your journey between India and the US and everywhere else around the world, what stands out?
What stands out? I think that's a deep question. I think what stands out is how different the cultures are in India and the US, yet they are similar in so many ways. And for people like us, right? I mean, like, where we have spent half the career in the US, half the career in India, we are in a unique position where we can compare, contrast, and pick the best and make our life better by picking what works for us and also giving back where we can deliver the most value and impact. So yeah, it's
That is
unique,
a very
unique,
deep
unique to people like
answer.
us and unique to our times as well, where these two large countries, economies provide that opportunity for seamless movement and business. Of
Yeah.
course, a lot of things are changing as well, but I kind of feel like largely the India-US corridor is wide open. A lot of people like us go back and forth, and that's something stands out.
How has that changed? It's been a long time since you stepped foot in the US, and I'm dating us, so forgive
Yeah.
me, but but how has do you think things have changed, especially when you look through the lens of culture? Some would argue the cultures don't change, others say cultures evolve. But obviously, there is an impact on how you exercise cultural values through the lens of macroeconomic shifts, which have also happened. So when you look back 20 years, 25, 30 years, how have things changed? What is the biggest change that you think when you reflect on it that you've experienced?
I think I have to think hard on this one. Like, maybe I'll tell you my story and my journey. Like, I mean,
Sounds good.
so when did I go to the US the first time? So the very first time I went to the US was at the turn of the century in year 2000. That's 25 years ago, right? I went to the US because I used to work for a company called Procter& and Gamble in India, and their headquarters was in Cincinnati. So I got a business visa. I had to work hard to get a business visa. It was like an interview, and I had to go to the embassy. I still very vividly remember because I mean that's something that's very etched in my memory that I was excited but also very anxious. Got the visa, made the first trip. Never been in a flight which is like transoceanic flight, right? I never crossed the Atlantic, and all my flights before that were like very local, domestic India flights. So the very thought of being in a plane for like more than 10, 15 hours was like unimaginable. I land in a city called Cincinnati. The very first thing that struck me is how empty the place was. I was coming from India. Even at 3 a.m. at night, you'll see people on the streets. And particularly in an airport, you'll always find a lot of people. And when I landed there, hardly anyone. So that's first thing that strikes you is like, okay, very few people, a lot of infrastructure, but no one out there. The second thing that strikes you is, how things are so well organized and systematic, almost like a clockwork. So those things strike you. The other thing I also struck me was when I traveled to the US the first time, uh, you know, I found very few people from India in those days. I mean, of course, there were Indians there, but not too many. The diversity in terms of the nationality was much lower in a town like Cincinnati, which is a Midwestern town, right? So that's a couple of things that struck with me. It was only a 4-day trip. Of course, I had my own issues with like what would I eat and transportation. Like I was not very comfortable how to get a taxi here and everything. Like the first time you go to the US, all that teething issues come up. But my real move to US happened with Wharton, right? I mean, as you know, along two of us went to Wharton together. So that was in 2004. We made the second trip to the US. And this was like a much more transformational shift because clearly, adjusting to the life in Philadelphia, adjusting to the school culture, everything. And there, this whole cultural side also became very apparent, right? I mean, how we came from a bit of a different culture in India, so adjusting to the culture in US, and you could see the difference between people like me and people who were Native American, like people who were local from US, and how they were like hanging out, socializing. So all of that, and also learning the local parlance, understanding the local sports, trying to fit in. So yeah, I mean those things. So just to summarize this, I mean, clearly what I see now versus what was there 25 years ago was clearly the technology has taken over, right? So many things that now we use in India are the same thing used in the US. So you don't feel that big a difference. Like simple example, taxi, right? I mean, you use Uber in India, you can use Uber in US. So like there's no kind of adjustment. You can just flip the country and you can do that, right? Everything is far more automated in India as well now. So you don't see that shift. Like people like 20 years ago, India was much more human driven, right? I mean, very manual processes. You have to deal with people a lot, and everywhere there used to be people in every process. So India has changed a lot, and US more or less has also changed, but the pace of change in India is much faster. So culturally, you see the gap has reduced in terms of adoption of technology, in terms of getting things done, in terms of doing business. Literally, on the other hand, US has changed a lot. The US, in my view, 25 years ago was less diverse and less aware of things outside the US because US was a self-contained economy. Everyone in the US were happy in the US. They never had to travel a lot outside the US. All business happened in the US. Everyone came to the US to do business. US was the largest economy. Over the last 25 years, US has grown, but has grown at a modest rate. But countries in Asia have grown much faster, particularly China and Southeast Asia. Even Middle East and Dubai has grown a lot. So US had to make that adjustment to understand the culture of these countries and become more accommodating. So I see that interesting transformation where countries like India moved up on the technology and adoption curve, while countries like US moved up on the cultural and diversity and openness to things out of the US curve. And that's the kind of change I see in the last 25 years.
I love it. Yeah. That first of all, the journey back to Wharton, that was the first time I ever went to the US. I'd never
Yeah.
stepped foot in the US. So you had at least one more trip on me.
4-day trip, I would say, not a long one, but a 4-day trip, which I was like, man, what happened to me in those 4 days? I'm like, where have I landed? Like, how do I even get to my place of work? How do I get something to eat? And what do I even eat here? That
Yeah.
4 days were like a total, like,
Blur.
this is a different world out here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do really like your analogy, which is that the US growth curve has predominantly been on the cultural, as you said, adoption curve, right? So whereas the Asian curve is more on the technology adoption, technology
Yeah,
evolution.
I would say technology adoption, but inside technology, it's like economic growth as well, right? Like that
Right.
is happening because the Asian economies grew at a faster rate. So they closed the gap with the US when it comes to economic growth. Well, the US had to also become open to things outside the US. It was a necessity for them because the economies in other countries were growing. So they also had to be open to understanding, accommodating, and appreciating things outside the US.
Yeah. Yeah. And how does that play through in, you've had some major roles, whether we were at McKinsey together, obviously in the US, but beyond that, when you went back to India, you've had roles, you ran Twitter India, you also were CEO of Network 18 Digital. And so there were some companies that were hyper, I would say, regional, then others were already multinational. And so when you describe these two adoption curves, as somebody running those businesses or growing those businesses, how do you navigate that as a leader? Those, because You then have to deal with both sides, right? You've got the two sides that are they're on a different curve. How do you do that? Like, what is your trick, or what was your trick back in the day to successfully make it work on both curves while you're one person?
Yeah, no, I think you picked up something very interesting, Rohit, and I think no one ever asked me that question. And the more I think about it, you know, for someone like me, what I had to do was to, how do you connect two different set of people with two different set of mindsets, cultural thinking, and upbringing, and how do you make them work together and sort of create value? Is sort of, if I were to describe in a very high level one line, that's what I had to do. That was the need of the job, right? And I'll tell you how that manifested in different roles, right? For example, when I moved to Flipkart from a company called Intuit is a Bay Area company, very American company. Most revenues comes from the US. 95% revenue comes from the US. So they have no reason to look outside US, and they were very US centric. Everyone I worked with or worked for or worked along, they had a very strong US orientation, right? From that, when I moved to Flipkart, it was a very Indian company trying to figure out how to deliver products to Indians living in tier 2, tier 3 towns. And how do you do that with the right level of, you know, price and service level? So to me, that was a cultural shock because to begin with, it was a very Indian company.
Yeah.
And moreover, it was solving a very Indian problem in a very operationally intensive manner in a, not even in cities, but in smaller towns. So looking at that setup and then trying to, upgrade operations and processes, like that was my contribution, but also they contributed to my own growth by educating me on what the real India is all about. So I sort of act as a connector, right? I mean, like, of course, I was coming with a much larger setup, with a much more refined processes, to someone where they were educating me on, like, okay, this is how real India works. This is how business gets done. The same challenge I had when I was at Network 18, because, um, you know, I speak, my education has mostly been English, went to English college, English school, but Network 18 was like a conglomerate of 18 Indian languages. So we have publications and broadcasting in 18 languages. And the majority of the most popular one was, of course, Hindi. And we had content operations in almost every state in India. So that was another challenge for me. And big part of that was like, okay, how do we bring the efficiency and the objectivity and the skill level so that we can operate as a listed company and try to really push the needle on many of the business outcomes. But also I had to educate myself on, like, how the content gets produced in real India, how the stories surface, what are the challenges you have to deal with, all the legal challenges as well. Sort of, I was like stuck in between. I would say, I won't use the word stuck, but I was sort of blessed to see both sides
Yeah.
and, learn so much by like just comparing and contrasting and saying, okay, how do I deal with this and how do I deal with that? And there are people on the both sides. People always have good intentions. People wake up every day to say, we want to do a good job and we want to be successful and we want to put our best foot forward. But when they come together, you can see that the mindset is educated by their upbringing. So they might look at things in a very different way. They might be suspicious of the other group of people. So your role as a leader becomes like, okay, how do I get them on the same page? How do I make sure that they keep an open mind? How do I make sure that they are able to listen well, appreciate the other point of view, and have an start with good intent, right? I mean, assume good intent of the other party
Yeah.
and ensure that good work gets done by bringing them together. And that becomes a role of a leader because, of course, you have your technical skills and your business skills. But when you can't get the team work together, all of them are useless. And many times we used to run into those challenges, not only at a central level versus regional levels in the company, but also between functions. For example, as a CEO, I had the business functions, the salespeople, and I also had these editorial people. And of course, the business person wants to make more revenue, and rightfully so, because that's what we need to do to run a profitable operations and be able to pay salaries. But the editorial person is looking for the right story. They're looking for the right kind of reach, coverage. And sometimes it may not be very lucrative. So how do we make sure that both sides appreciate one another and don't see each other as enemies? So that becomes another where the cultural part and sort of you have to understand the culture of the function as well, and trying to sort of make them appreciate and understand each other. Similarly, on Twitter, my role was very interesting, like India head, but then the headquarters was in the US. So very strange challenge, right? How do you make a Bay Area headquartered leaders who think everything is in Bay Area, help them appreciate what India is and what is required for India, not only in terms of content operations, but also in terms of product operations, in terms of like, what it needs to be successful in India. So a big part of my job was to like make a trip to the US every 3 months, sit with the Twitter's leadership team and the board, give them an update about what's happening in India, but also get their commitment to support India and the unique needs of India. Like, for example, in India, voice is huge, right? I mean, more than the text. So launching Twitter Spaces in India first was one example. Similarly, in India, while English is the language which Twitter flourishes in, but there is also local languages that have to be promoted, right? That's another one. A big thing was cricket. Most people in Bay Area don't understand cricket at all. And for me, like, you can't have Twitter if you don't have the real-time scores and commentary about all the cricketers on Twitter, right? So we had to strike deals and we have to make sure that all the cricket community comes on Twitter. Otherwise, Twitter has no relevance for India if
Yeah.
there's no cricket. And the folks in Bay Area don't understand, like, what's the big deal about cricket? Like, what's this cricket thing all about? So educating them on the
Yeah.
great game of cricket and then saying it's like a baseball, but with a different kind of a bat. Like, I had to get to that level.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
Yeah.
I can
It's
tell you
really
some
it's
anecdotes.
really
It's
interesting, Manish,
amazing.
because one thing that for those listening who have not spent time in India or may not be as familiar with it firsthand, they may have heard of it, is that India in itself is an amalgamation, to your point, of so many cultures that it almost gives you the muscle that, if you grew up in a sort of individual culture where there's like a singular language, maybe there's some variances, but for the most part, singular, there is a benefit to that because you obviously have singular culture, so it's very easy to communicate through the country. But with India, I think what you're saying is that being an Indian entrepreneur, business owner, and leader, it gave you like that training, even though you probably didn't think of it that way in the beginning, of being able to adapt to different cultures within India. And so when that happens, would you say that Indian entrepreneurs, Indian business owners, I would hate to say a leg up, but have a distinctive advantage when they look outward because they've had so much practice in having to adapt, adopt, change, amalgamate, streamline different cultures that when they go overseas, it actually benefits them because now they know how to do it. They just still have to learn the new language of the new culture, but they know what the skills are required because they've had that practice. Or do you think that is a disadvantage because there's so much, streamlining that has to happen? You almost wish that you didn't have to do it. I mean, it's a lot easier when there's a single culture, just do it rather than have to bring 18 different languages together. How have you thought about what gave you and gives other Indian leaders advantage versus holds them back from, doing something where a foreign leader may not have to do? And so they use up all their energy the next three things because they're not navigating these sort of the minutia of cultural differences.
Yeah, right. So very astute observation you made. And I think, like, my views agree with your views in terms of the advantages, but I have a different view in terms of the disadvantages. There's also the downside of this. So let's start with the advantages part. Like, what does it give you? Like, of course, you learn to live with ambiguity, you learn to live with complexity, you learn to live with diversity, right? I mean, those are the required because it becomes so much second nature that you don't even think about it. Subconsciously, you learn all of that. Like in a team, you can have a person from North India, from Punjab. You can, in the same team, you can have a person from South India, Tamil Nadu, and the only common thing is the language English, and probably the fact that okay, we are all Indians, right? I mean, that's the only thing. And other than that, the language is different, the sports habits are different, the food habits are different, everything is different, right? So one is that. So that's the part of it, right? That which you rightly pointed out that subconsciously you learn about diversity. So when you go to a different country, the differences do hit you, but then you know how to deal with that. Like you are not taken aback. Like you don't expect everything to be in place on day one, and you can deal with ambiguity. The downside, one downside, is you rightly pointed out, is doing things in India is complex. But I won't attribute to that to the cultural side of it. It's just that the processes have not evolved and have become advanced. Like for example, now if I look at India now, versus India 10 years ago. In India 10 years ago, doing business in India was very complicated because every state had their own taxation system, their own local laws for sales tax. With GST coming in, it's unified. With UPI coming in, you can make any payment anywhere in India with a click of a button. It's simpler than the US. So processes have become better. And also, as a country, a unified culture has come over the regional culture. Like everyone associates themselves with India, Indian things. They have common, sort of more evolved common taste, at least in the cities. If you go to like smaller towns, the regional cultures become very strong. If you go to UP, very strong UP culture. If you go to Punjab, very strong Punjab culture, very strong Tamil Nadu culture. But you look at the cosmopolitan cities like Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, these places, Hyderabad, very strong city-specific culture. And that you can also see reflected in the sporting events and IPLs and everything else, right? So that is that. The complexity, the downside of living in a country like India, growing up here, and is that sometimes you get so much caught up in this complex system that you also become insular. You feel like, okay, this is the world and this is what it is. And that's how I was before I moved out of India for the first time. Like I thought India is the thing, right? I mean, when you leave India and you go to a different country, you realize that, okay, there's another country there, there's another way of doing things. And like you are so caught up in this large complex country that you are fully consumed. Like I don't know how you feel, but in the US, I always have free time because there's no clutter. Like I do my thing, I have a regular schedule. I still get time for my physical activity, my running, etc. I have still weekends for my household work. In India, when I'm in India, there's so much going on. I mean, not just in terms of the people who reach out to you, the connections you have, but also in the media, in the politics, in movies, in entertainment, weekend events. That the whole week and the month goes by and you realize that, okay, you never had the time to even think about yourself. Forget about the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Like people don't get so much time because India, one part of India is that it's a young country, demographically very blessed, and a lot of aspiration, a lot of activities happening. So you get caught up in so many things. As compared to a mature, stable country like the US, where the process is there, process works. So no one has to do any hustle so much. Like you do one thing and you set it up, all your payments happen automatically, all your groceries come, all your business dealings happen in the right thing. People reply to their email at the right pace. People go 9, 6, by 6, they come back, and I think they have a evening. Things are so well scheduled. In India, it's so consuming. I mean, I sometimes feel like if you want to remain young, come to India because you'll never feel old. You'll not have the time to feel like you're old.
That's
So
funny.
that's the difference I notice.
I love it. But I think one thing you said earlier, as you were describing bringing 18 different languages or cultures together, and then having to, in the case of Twitter, educating the American founders and global leaders on the Indian culture. If you had to, so somebody listening in right now who says, "Hey, look," and we'll take two examples. Example one is a non-India based company who wants to expand in India. And listening to you, they're like, holy moly, how am I going to navigate all this? I know there's a great opportunity, the market's growing, and let's assume there's a product market fit. We won't get into the specifics of how to figure that out, but let's say there's that. So what's your counsel to somebody who is looking outside into India, has never been there before, and saying, maybe I should just have Manish run India for me, or find the next Manish, right? So that's one idea. But is there another way that you would counsel them that they should attack the Indian market? And then similarly, Indians looking out, whether it's a startup or a fully fledged growth company looking to expand overseas. And we can take US as an example, but you've had examples and you've worked in Southeast Asia, so you can use those as well. What would your counsel be to those who's like, hey, I think I've done pretty well in India. I think it's time to fly. And so what's your one advice for each of them as they think of expanding?
Yeah, let me think about it, right? So first is US into India. So clearly, India is large and complex. But if you are a company looking into India as a market, I think the way to cut down complexity and the size is to get focused on what is your core strength or the core product that you want to offer. And then slice the market into where do I have the best fit for that? Because while it is India as a large country, there are many Indias within India, right? I
Yeah.
mean, for everything, for every city, every region, every language, every community, there's a very different way they operate, right? So while all encompassing, we see that India is one monolith, but it is not really a monolith, right? So the question would be, like, I'll give a real example, right? PNG, when it came to India in early, like 1999, 98, they launched something called Whisper sanitary napkin in India. Like, it was a very unheard thing to say, okay, you'll be selling sanitary napkins to Indian women, right? Where I think the cloth was the prevalent one, and I think feminine hygiene was not a big discussion topic, or it was a taboo topic to even discuss, right? But they were able to be successful because they were able to identify a segment of girls, schoolgirls hitting puberty and going to college, the young adults in those days, and really having a targeted way of reaching out to them through community and through the local workers, and really having a sharp messaging and positioning for them, right? So if they had thought that, okay, how do I sell this anti-napkin to Indian women? And there are so many diverse ways, diverse kind of communities across India, from city to village to regions in India, they would have never made it happen, right? But they focused on like only urban adult, urban population, and also picking them young when they hit the puberty, that point in time. So if you're sharply pointed and you have a very clear understanding of where your strength is, and you go after that, you can find the right India for your need. Let me put it
Yeah.
this way, right? That's one. Second is, of course, when it comes to talent, like, you will have to have the right team on the ground, because if you are from outside the US, that would be something where a lot of people make a lot of mistakes and they learn through the mistakes. I think my understanding there is that you need at least two sets of people, or at least two people. Like, if you have a small team, at least two kind of people. One is someone who understands the headquarter needs and the requirements of the shareholders there as to what they need from a business outcome, and one of a more local operational guy who understands how things actually get done on the ground. If you can have the same thing in a single person, ideal. Otherwise, these two skill sets have to work in close coordination to make things successful, because you may operationally do quite a few things, but it may not get appreciated in your headquarters. And actually, you might end up firing the whole operational team because you realize that they are doing a lot of good work, but they are not doing the work that you want. On the other hand, if you have the right kind of team that understands the headquarter needs, they will be great thinkers. They can make the right strategy deck, but they will not be able to do anything on the ground because they'll be sitting in their hotel and office and just
Yeah.
pontificating that, oh, we'll do this, we'll do that. But nothing will actually happen on the ground. So you need to have the two.
I just want to for those listening, I want to say something back that you said, which has really resonated with me, which is you have to find your India within India. That's a really, really important, simple, but very important thing to say. And I sort of brushed away the product market fit. I think you brought it right back into the core of things, which is, you may have most brilliant product slash service slash anything else you come in, but there are a lot of Indias, going back to your words, within India. And
Yes.
so you have to find your India. And I love that. I think that's
Yeah.
really, even for me, I've been away for a very long time, but even then, when I think about everything you're saying, it resonates, because how would you, bring a foreign product? It's not just the product, it's the principles, it's the practices, it's the mindset, it's the culture in which that product was developed, and now you're applying it into a completely different culture. And it goes back to the beginning of our conversation. The cultural nuances matter. And within India, there's no one culture, right? Yes, it's becoming that way in certain specific parts, to your previous point. However, you've got to find for your product, for your service, which part of India, which people of India would actually resonate with. I love that. Thank you. I didn't mean to interrupt, but
Yeah.
that's really wise
I'll just add
counsel.
like few examples, right? I mean, if you think about it, because India is such a large country of 1.4 billion people, also there is huge diversity in terms of income level and socio-economic fabric, right? So if you think about anything that is launched in the US, like for example, a new iPhone is launched, there'll be demand for those in India as well, like from the people who live in the cities or people who are very urban, affluent people who want to be in the cutting edge of technology.
Yeah.
At the same time, you'll find people in the villages who sort of, just want a voice based some kind of communication because they're not even comfortable anything else, right? So you will find that as well. Like, while India has progressed a lot, you'll see the huge diversity and differences in the way it has progressed, right? So you can find the right thing for yourself, right? In that sense, right? It's also a country where people still value a lot of yoga and like traditional ways of doing things. You also see health enthusiasts who are buying the latest like iWatch and like your fitness band, So you see that coexist, that a yoga guru teaching your Surya Namaskars in the more traditional way, and the same yoga guru might also be wearing a fitness band. And I feel like it's all coexist in a very beautiful way.
Yeah,
So
that's
I see
cool.
that almost every day. I mean, I live in Bangalore, and I see like you can have the most honest discussion about the huge differences that is there across the world, and still be friends with someone because people have seen everything there, right? I mean, everything coexists
Yeah,
in a very
yeah.
peaceful way.
And this goes back to the thing that we were discussing a few minutes ago, and I love what you're touching on, which is it all comes back to the people, right? It literally comes back to the people. It always does, and it's not a coincidence that the People Quotient podcast, because I do believe that ultimately, when you think about businesses, when you think about expansion, when you think about cultures, it's all by the people for the people. And so, I think to your point, the thing that you mentioned earlier in terms of having had the exposure to a lot of diversity and variety, not just in cultures, but in concepts, in the way of thinking, in the way of upbringing, education, legacies, that provides for a good foundation to be able to have that conversation you were describing. Right?
Yeah.
And in a culture where that doesn't exist as freely or hasn't in the past, it just takes time to get there. And
Yes.
and sometimes it gets there quickly, other times it may take a while. But one of the benefits of India, and that's what somebody coming into India who's never spent time has to appreciate that. And I think you didn't say this, but I'll say it is one of the other things is before you launch anything in India, go spend some time in India.
No, that
And
goes
even
without saying, right? I mean,
yeah,
because
because
what
that'll
you
blow your
like,
mind, I'm sure.
yeah, once you're on the ground here, I think your appreciation and your understanding will increase like tenfold. Like when you see it with your own eyes and you experience it for a few days. I also want to complete the other part of your question, which is like an Indian company or Indian going to the US or other countries. I think one thing I I notice is that because US and other countries are far more refined and far more evolved, clearly uh, the people, when we think about like launching something or even like putting a team together, you have to be in a slightly more evolved state, I would say, like both in terms of product market fitment, product journey, but also in terms of your own culture and processes, like has to be more well defined. Because one thing I notice is that in India, ambiguity is fine. People can live with ambiguity and they're okay with ambiguous thing, and things get themselves clarified over time. But when I deal with in the US, I have to be very clear, right? What is white and what is black, and sort of what I'm saying has to be clearly articulated in words as well, because there is less tolerance for ambiguity, and people do not want to leave things to chance. People want to have clarity, like even a daily schedule, right? If you have an event or a conference in the US, the schedule is very well defined, right? What will happen at 9 a.m. and what time the tea will be served and what time the lunch will happen. On the other hand, in India, yes, there's intent to be on time, but time is just a guideline. If you enjoy a conversation and a panel is going really well, it will get extended. People will be fine with that. In the evening, people will hang around and sort of, do things that they like to do. So you cannot force people too much beyond a point. You can give them a guideline. Now, there's a good and bad of it. I mean, clearly, it does mean that things don't happen as scheduled, but it also means there's a lot of serendipity and there's a lot of social connect that happens, which has to be forced in a US setup. Like when you are in a more evolved setup, you have to create opportunities for people to socially connect and become friends. In India, it happens much more organically. Like you just connect with people and you start talking and you just show up at their houses and they invite you to events, and like it happens organically without a system or a setup or a structure to be put in
Yeah.
place consciously.
Does
So
that
that's I
does
noticed
that
one.
make I want to clarify, given what you said that the Indian ways allows for more ambiguity in the system, in the construct, does that make Indian business owners and entrepreneurs more risk tolerant? Or does that actually create a false sense of risk tolerance? And you would counsel saying, hey, ambiguity shouldn't be portrayed as like, oh, we can take on more risk. Those are two different things.
It works both ways, right? I mean, the way I put it is that it has positives, it also has its shadows, right? So positives are like um, people in an early stage startup where ambiguity is the name of the game. Many Indian entrepreneurs start like that, right? I mean, like there are a lot of entrepreneurship there. And I'm not talking about just tech entrepreneurship, where I think Bay Area is clearly the leader, but I think all kind of general entrepreneurship. Like most Indians, salaried job has not been the very first thing they would do. They would do something entrepreneurial as well. The downside is that if you tolerate ambiguity for too long and you don't define processes, your scalability takes
Yep.
a hit. You
Yep.
can't scale process; it becomes a subscale operations because there are too much variances, and then when something has so many variances, you can't scale up, and you always need a human in the loop. Then technologically, to make something technologically scalable, you have to have precise measurement and precise process, right? So that's the downside of it. So having said that, now what is happening in India also is that you'll see that more refined businesses, more urban settings, more educated, like people who have been best educated, they behave very much like what you would see in the US. So you'll see exactly the same process, culture, things. You will also see that there's an intermediate hybrid group where they are comfortable with some ambiguity, but they also want some process, and they, of course, they'll find the other ones which are never exposed to anything. So where, like, if you think about it, I'll give a very good example, right? Calling a plumber in India, right? I mean, it used to be like a very ambiguous process. You call someone will show up. When they will show up, you don't know. They will come, they will fix it, not fix it. How long will it last? Everything was ambiguous. You have to deal with it. And we didn't know anything better, right? I mean, that's how a carpenter or plumber was the most ambiguous activity. But then there's a company which came called Urban company. It was Urban Club, it became Urban. They tried to create process systems with the whole rating review system, almost like a Uber system, where they would define, like, in plumbing, what is it's a water leakage, a faucet issue, which is something like they try to define like which work in plumbing. They put an estimate and they put a workforce together. They have been largely successful, but only in urban areas, of course, where people are professionals and they want, like, I want reliability, right? I'm happy to pay more, but I want reliability. On the other hand, the rest of the India will not like that because they are okay with some ambiguity at a lower cost. Plus, I mean, they don't like the whole putting straight jacketing everything into something, because even today, when I call a plumber using Urban Clap, I call him with a certain defined work. But when he comes here, he also says, like, this is broken. I can also fix that. I can fix this. And I also find, like, if you come here anyway, why don't you fix it? And then it becomes a more like a, like,
Great.
we become adjusting to each other, right? He
Yeah.
understands my need. I understand his need. And, like, okay, fine. You can do those other things as well, even though we just called you for this thing. And then I'll pay him extra for that as well. So that's where you start thinking, right? That yes, there is some process to the place, but there's also, there's so many things we have to go with it. So
Yeah.
it requires a bit of a maturity to think about, like, okay, why it is happening this way? Number one, that as a curious person, you have to ask, like, why it is happening this way? Is there a better way to do it, or is this the best way? And as the human needs and the behavior and the culture changes, where would this go? And are we ready for it or not? Like, as humans, or living in a certain socioeconomic fabric, when would we be adopting of this, and where would this go? And I think there's no easy answer, the right answer, but I think everyone's trying different things, and I think it's lovely to see how things are evolving everywhere.
I agree with you, and I think this notion, if I was to summarize what you were saying, if you're an Indian entrepreneur or business owner wanting to go overseas, especially to the US market, but pretty much anywhere overseas, what you're saying is you just have to be further along in your maturation curve to be able to successfully land that plane in the US market or international market. Whereas within the local market, while there are ranges of ambiguity, it's still okay enough to say, okay, a little, so you don't have to be as polished. So your counsel to those listening saying, hey, I've got a pretty good business, I've crushed my local market. I just don't want to, I'm ready to go overseas. What would be one or two things, measurable or not, that you would say to them, hey, before you do that, A and B has to be in place before you start even thinking about global expansion of
Great
your startup?
question. Great question. I think you summarized it quite well. So if you're an Indian businessman Indian person or Indian business person trying to expand in the US, I would say that test your product with your most refined audience in the cities, urban cities, which are highly demanding. And if you get good scores or good net promoter score from that customers, and these would be people who have lived in Western economies, developed economies, people who have come back from those places, or also people who are local but who have more refined, sort of more advanced needs, I would say. So if you can test a product with them and you get good scores, good net promoter score, then you can have confidence that yes, you have built something that is meeting the need of a certain different kind of an audience, which is more reflective of the audience in say US or in other developed countries.
Yeah. I like that. I like that. Find your is go
Most
the other
demanding
way around.
customers, more I would say more process centric customers who shun ambiguity, who want clarity, who value their time a lot. Because there's another trade-off is between time and money, right? In India, which you see that very beautifully. In the US, it's always time is prioritized and money is a way to deliver. Like the way the thinking goes in the US is like you have 24 hours in a day. So let's prioritize your time. So any amount of money you're willing to spend is a function of how much value your time. It's always that trade-off, right? In India, except for the very very like the top earners and people who are like in the top positions, most people have a very different trade-off, right? They for them, well, time is important, but then of course it's not as important. So the trade-off works out very differently in India, and therefore you see a different behavior that you cannot charge too high for something which is very service oriented because people will realize that oh, I can get the same thing done at a lower price somewhere else. I might have to walk or I might have to call three people, but I'm okay to do that. I can get a 50% discount in doing that, right? So then you have to think very creatively, like what can you do? For example, like classic example is Netflix, right? Netflix came to India with their US pricing, and it didn't work out well because what was happening was like people were getting one subscription and they were sharing their user ID and password with the entire family and also with their entire school group as well, right? And then Netflix, it took them some time to realize that okay, people value the privacy money trade-off came out, right? Which is like in the US, people value their privacy; they will never share their Netflix account with anyone because they don't want people to know what they're watching. In India, it's like fine. I mean, like if I can save money, why not, right? So then they had to come out with a slightly tweaked version where not only they reduce the price of subscription so that the incentive to share password is lower, they also limited how many devices can you run it on. So they were like, noting down how many devices the Netflix account has been activated. And at any point in time, you can only activate on 3 accounts or 3 devices. So not only they had to do a bit of a pricing hack, but also understanding the ecosystem in which it was being used and then come with a technical solution so that you cannot activate the Netflix account on more than
Yeah.
3 devices.
I think you just raised a really interesting point that complements what you were saying before about a foreign business expanding into India. Is not only find your India within your India, but also don't assume that your process and business model is going to work. In fact,
That's a good point.
it'll
Yeah.
be broken. The India will break it,
And
so
it will make you think in interesting ways so that your product becomes even better and future proof.
right. Yeah.
Okay, in future as well. Now you realize that okay, that was
Yeah.
always a good idea to limit the number of devices but it never occurred to you in the US because you never saw that behavior. But it's a good idea that why would you want people to use it on 100 devices, one account,
And they've
right?
done that now. Netflix has gone global with that, right? Like so
Yeah,
now,
yeah,
if you have an account in the US, and so you can't transport it, but you can't share it. So it's not just limited to India. I think they've taken
yeah.
that concept and expanded it. So probably
That's a great thing. I think maybe innovate in India and then sort of if you can
correct.
innovate in India and make something work, you can
Make
make it
it.
work everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Manish, I know you're, as we're wrapping up, I know you've recently launched a venture fund that does exactly what we've been talking about, which is helping entrepreneurs on both sides of the ocean or, between India and US to go back and forth. Talk to us a little bit about what what are you building and why have you decided to go into this at this stage of your career? Because given your background, you could have done another startup, another large public company, multinational, but you chose to go build a VC fund. Talk to us a bit about that.
No, great. Would love to talk more. So I think there are two needs here, right? One is at a personal level, what is the right thing to do, and also at a societal level, at an economic level, what is the right thing to do. Personally, yeah, I mean, as you rightly said, I could have done many things, but I also feel that I have seen so much. I have been part of so many ecosystems and so many companies and setups. There is so much knowledge out there, and the best way to benefit other people from this knowledge is to, somehow be a cheerleader and be a person who can support them, not just with money, but also with expertise, knowledge. And that's a great way. One great way to do that would be to become a venture capitalist and invest in their companies. And by doing so, you're available to them all the time, right? The money is only the small part. The big part is like they have access to you and your network and your knowledge. That's one. The second thing is why this whole US India corridor and why someone like me doing it, right? So if I look at my unique background, and that's where we started as well, this conversation, that I have uniquely traveled between this and existed in this US India corridor for the last 2 decades. Half my career I have been in the US, half my career I have been physically in India. But throughout my career, I've always managed this India US, I would say, work, right? I mean, either had a headquarter in the US or I had Indian headquarter, but then we were operating globally as well and mostly in the US.
Yeah.
So I've seen this. And my view is that this is a underappreciated strategy, and an underappreciated strategy, particularly in the early stage startup and the venture industry, because most venture capital is either US capital in US companies, which think about going global or going to India much later when most of the value addition has already happened, or Indian companies locally innovating, but then not thinking early enough about what is the global play there, right? So our view is that we go from seed to Series A. We identify companies which are have some kind of product market fitment in the local market, and they would immensely benefit both in terms of market size, but also in terms of the risk management and also innovation, cross fertilizing ideas between two economies by thinking about moving out of the like expanding beyond the home market to the other big market. And I think at this point in time, the way the geopolitics is, this bilateral relationship is becoming more and more important than the multilateral world that we all grew up in, because the multilateral system of rule based order is no longer working out. And India, US are the two largest economies. I mean, US, of course, is the largest economy. And India is not far behind. I mean, India is number 3 right now in purchasing power parity, with China being the second. But for most US companies, China is sort of off the table now. So the next logical economy is India. So many US companies are looking to grow beyond home market. And India is a very logical choice, and we help them in that respect as well. So ours is a $100 million kind of a fund. 8%, 80, 20% would be invested in US companies trying to go global, particularly India. And then 20 to 30% would be invested in Indian companies trying to go to the US. And we believe that this bidirectional shared market access is a great way to create tremendous economic value. And plus, personally for me, I mean, we started with people and culture. No better way to stay young and stay active than to be with amazing founders who are trying to traverse this India US corridor, like I have done for the last 2 decades.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. Like every time I speak with somebody who through the course of my work, either has founded a company and is in early stages, or it's sort of the growth or late stage or exited. Like no matter where they are in the life cycle, I just think they're so inspiring. It is a tough. I mean, we've both lived it. I'm still living it. It is being an entrepreneur is a pretty tough thing to do, and very inspiring for those. So being in the thick of it and trying to help them tackle the next challenge, and maybe they'll listen to this podcast and some of them will say, okay, i need to find a human that's on the ground and go to India and visit. I think that makes a lot of sense. My last question for you, Manish, as we wrap up, is if you were to leave those listening, whether it's those founders that you will be working with or anyone else who's, whether they're living in the US or India, expat or not, what's the one, as they're thinking about expanding their business or building their companies, you can pick any variety. What's the one thing that you would leave them, say, hey, as you're thinking about this thing, please do this, and then please avoid this or don't do this. So a do and a don't that would help them instantly. It's like free counsel right here for
This
those
is
who
counsel
can.
for like startup founders. Is that, just to be very clear?
Yeah, it could be for startup founders. It could be for people who've actually built their business, have scaled it, and now are looking for the next, horizon for scale. And so now looking to go overseas and saying, look, I've dominated the local market. Now let's go international. So it could be
Yeah.
either
No,
or.
now that you asked this question, I want to also tell you that this dichotomy that you can only go global when you scale is no longer relevant in the world of technology and AI. I mean, we are seeing that you can start a company overnight, have all the AI tools and agents, and then next day you can go global.
Yep.
We are seeing that happen as well. And I think in a world like that, clearly technology becomes less of a concern, like particularly when you're looking at application of technology. There's so many tools out there. What is important though is that if you want to build a successful business or be successful, you have to have a solid insight and understanding about the customer problem. You need to really know who your customer is and what is the real problem. How you solve it is a much lower order thing, because most people, they get so excited about their technology and the how part of it, they forget the why and the what part. The why part is far more important. That's one. Second is, be surrounded by solid people, like solid people in the sense that people who are not just competent and smart, but also people who have integrity and who have, I would say the right attitude. Integrity and attitude matters a lot more. Integrity, attitude, and loyalty towards a cause matters a lot more than just sheer competence or skill sets, right? Of course,
Yep.
you want that as well,
Yep.
but never compromise on the integrity and the ethics part of it. I think if you do that, and then you leverage really well, you can be really successful and you can go global the next day. You don't have to, like, scaling and going global. We always used to think growing up that, okay, they are sequential. You become big and then you go global. I think in the world of technology, that sequentiality has been broken. It's your choice as a founder when you are ready and what's your intent and what do you want to do. You can go global the next day.
Yeah, I love it. Manish, this has been amazing. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you. There's so many golden nuggets throughout the discussion. I'm sure the people listening will take a lot out of it. Thank you for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rohit. I mean, pleasure to talk to you, and it's always good to connect. And thank you so much. You have been a great interviewer, I would say. Yeah.
Thanks, man. Talk to you soon. Cheers.
Take care.
Bye. Check out our full-length episodes on the People Quotient podcast. Subscribe now.